It is a mystery that has captivated people across the entire globe for centuries. Does Bigfoot really exist? Well, now there is a man called Snake the Bigfoot Hunter who claims he has found.
In the choked, freezing silence of the Adirondack wilderness, something ancient drew its final breath.
Hello, America. My name is Snake the Bigfoot Hunter, Stuart, and I am a Bigfoot hunter, and I've been hunting Bigfoot for the past 12 years.
When veteran tracker Charles "Snake" Stuart stumbled upon the towering 300-pound preserved remains of a massive hominid, he knew the history books were dead wrong. This was Dack, the Bigfoot corpse, not a shadow, but a cold, physical reality. Yet, the ultimate shock wasn't the creature's immense size or brutal claws. It was the silent, dried, ancient blood. But the code inside the bone held an even darker secret. The genetics of a giant, the Neanderthal bombshell. The true battleground of this discovery is not fought in the muddy trenches of field research, but under the blinding white lights of a genetics laboratory. And, to understand the sheer magnitude of what tracker Charles "Snake" Stuart claims to have dragged out of the dense undergrowth of the Adirondacks, one must look past the decaying flesh, the matted hair, and the towering skeletal structure. When Charles "Snake" Stuart stepped forward with what he asserted was a complete biological specimen, the immediate reaction from the public was one of expectation. They wanted physical metrics. They wanted to know the height, the weight, and the sheer footprint of the beast. But Stuart, a seasoned outdoorsman who has spent decades studying the silent spaces of the American wilderness, knew that physical measurements alone would never suffice. In the modern era, flesh can be sculpted, hair can be synthesized, and bone can be replicated. To demand the world's attention, Charles "Snake" Stuart needed to produce something that could not be manufactured. A pristine sequence of prehistoric DNA. The sequence he presented to the public was nothing short of an evolutionary hand grenade. According to Stuart, the genetic profile of the specimen he named Dack consists of precisely 58.5% Neanderthal DNA and 41.5% Homo sapiens DNA. To the untrained ear, those numbers might sound like a simple ancestry breakdown, perhaps a distant relative from a forgotten branch of the family tree. But to geneticists, anthropologists, and evolutionary biologists, that specific ratio is a profound impossibility that threatens to dismantle our entire understanding of human migration, survival, and genetic inheritance. To put this genetic profile into perspective, one has to look at the baseline of modern human biology. Today, any living human being of non-African descent carries a tiny, lingering trace of Neanderthal heritage, typically ranging between 1% and 2%. This minuscule fraction is the genetic echo of brief, localized interbreeding events that occurred roughly 50,000 to 60,000 years ago when modern humans first migrated out of Africa and encountered Neanderthal populations in Eurasia. Over tens of thousands of years, through generations of dominant Homo sapiens breeding, that Neanderthal signature was diluted, washed out, and reduced to a mere whisper in our genome. Now, consider the genetic profile that Charles Stuart claims to have mapped from Dack. A specimen with 58.5% Neanderthal DNA is not a distant ancestral echo. Biologically, a ratio of roughly 60 to 40 suggests a creature that is only a single generation or two removed from a pure, unhybridized Neanderthal parent. For such a ratio to exist in a living, breathing biological organism in the 21st century, it means that pure Neanderthals, a hominid branch officially declared extinct over 40,000 years ago, must have survived, completely intact, in parallel with modern humanity. This is the core of the revelation that Stuart has brought to the airwaves. If Dack the Bigfoot is indeed a huge percentage of Neanderthal hybrid, we are not looking at a primitive, bipedal ape. We are looking at a sister species of man. The implications of this rewrite the geopolitical and natural history of the North American continent. The standard archaeological model dictates that Clovis hunters and early human populations migrated across the Bering Land Bridge during the last ice age, colonizing an empty, pristine continent. If Charles "Snake" Stuart's genetic data holds true, then when those first human hunters stepped into the valleys of North America, they were not alone. The shadows of the pine forests were already occupied by an older, larger, and far more robust branch of the human family tree. The physiological consequences of a Neanderthal makeup explain almost every physical attribute associated with the legendary giant of the woods. Neanderthals were famous for their extreme physical adaptations to cold, harsh climates. They possessed barrel chests, immense lung capacities, dense bone structures, and thick, powerful musculature designed for explosive strength. A hybrid offspring, possessing nearly 60% of these genetic traits combined with the adaptive intelligence of Homo sapiens, would naturally develop into an apex predator capable of enduring the brutal, sub-zero winters of the northeastern United States. Charles "Snake" Stuart argues that Dack represents the ultimate evolutionary survivor, a creature that took the cold weather survival mechanics of the Neanderthal and fused them with the cognitive flexibility of early modern humans. Yet, the sheer stability of this genetic ratio raises unsettling questions about how such a population could persist through the millennia. If these hybrids were constantly interbreeding with modern humans throughout history, the Neanderthal percentage would have degraded down to the single digits long ago, just as it did in Europe and Asia. For Dack to retain a massive Neanderthal genome in the present day, the population from which he emerged must have practiced extreme generational isolation. They must have lived in highly insular, tightly knit family units deep within the wilderness, actively avoiding contact with Homo sapiens to preserve their genetic sovereignty. Charles "Snake" Stuart's findings suggest that these creatures did not just happen to avoid us. They made a conscious, evolutionary choice to remain in the dark, treating modern humanity as a territorial threat to be avoided at all costs. This genetic revelation transforms the creature from a creature of folklore into a displaced citizen of prehistory. It forces us to confront the reality that the wilderness is not merely a collection of trees, rivers, and wildlife, but a refuge for a highly evolved, deeply reclusive cousin of humanity. Every claw mark on a tree, every deep-chested vocalization echoing through the mountain passes, and every massive footprint pressed into the mud suddenly becomes the cultural artifact of a surviving hominid culture. Charles "Snake" Stuart has not just presented a body, he has presented a mirror, forcing humanity to look into a genetic makeup that is shocking, alien, and yet intimately familiar. How does an 8-foot predator remain hidden long enough to die of old age? The Adirondack recovery, the extraction of the Bigfoot. One must understand the brutal choked terrain where veteran tracker Charles "Snake" Stuart operates to understand how an 8-foot predator dies in absolute secrecy. The Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York are not a manicured public park. They comprise over 6 million acres of sprawling, unforgiving wilderness, defined by dense boreal forests, treacherous marshlands, and jagged granite peaks designed by nature to swallow secrets whole. For decades, Charles "Snake" Stuart had studied the subtle, overlooked signs of this wilderness: the snapped branches 6 feet above a tall man's head, the unexplained territorial markers, and the heavy, rhythmic thuds echoing through the valleys just before dawn. But nothing in his extensive years of tracking could have prepared Charles "Snake" Stuart for the moment he stepped off the beaten path and into a hidden, moss-draped ravine, coming face to face with a biological anomaly that would change his life forever. There, half concealed by falling autumn leaves and rotting hemlock, lay the massive, unmoving form of the creature he would name Dack. For Charles, the immediate sensation was not one of triumph, but of profound, heavy silence. The creature, measuring over 8 feet in length and weighing an estimated 300 pounds, lay stretched out on the damp forest floor, its life cycle completed in the absolute privacy of the deep woods. Charles "Snake" Stuart realized instantly that he was looking at a physical reality that mainstream science had declared an outright impossibility. He approached the silent giant with a mix of reverence and caution, realizing that Charles "Snake" Stuart was now the sole custodian of a secret that would shatter the foundations of modern anthropology. The physical specimen was breathtaking in its anatomical detail, proving to Charles "Snake" Stuart that this was no hoax. The skin was leathery, weathered by the elements, and covered in a dense, dark coat of coarse hair designed to repel the brutal mountain rain. The hands, which Charles "Snake" Stuart examined with forensic intensity, looked incredibly powerful, featuring thick, human-like nails and heavily calloused palms. Charles "Snake" Stuart observed that the facial structure of Dack had a pronounced brow ridge and a heavy, robust jaw, mirroring the exact hominid traits he had read about in evolutionary textbooks. The physical challenge of recovering Dack from the heart of the Adirondacks was an alpine nightmare that tested every ounce of Charles "Snake" Stuart's legendary wilderness survival skills. You do not simply carry a 300-pound, 8-foot-tall hominid out of a roadless backcountry ravine on your shoulders without a strategic plan. The terrain was a vertical maze of slick mud, loose rock, and dense, tangled underbrush that snagged at clothing and equipment with every agonizing step. Charles "Snake" Stuart had to work in absolute paranoid secrecy, acutely aware that any unusual activity in these protected state lands could draw the immediate hostile attention of park rangers, local authorities, or rival hunters who would gladly confiscate the find. Armed with basic ropes, a heavy-duty tactical tarp, and sheer physical determination, Charles "Snake" Stuart began the slow, brutal process of dragging the massive specimen across miles of trackless wilderness. Every yard gained was a battle against gravity, fatigue, and the fading daylight. Charles "Snake" Stuart had to carefully navigate around deep bogs and steep rock faces, constantly checking his shoulder to ensure he wasn't being tracked by the region's black bears, who would have been drawn to the scent. The physical toll on Charles "Snake" Stuart was immense. His muscles burned, his hands were raw, and the sheer psychological weight of what he was transporting threatened to paralyze his progress. He was carrying a biological treasure that could rewrite history, and Charles "Snake" Stuart knew that a single slip on the wet granite could destroy both his body and his evidence. What kept Charles "Snake" Stuart moving through those exhausting, freezing hours was the realization that this extraction had to be absolutely flawless to survive scientific scrutiny. If Charles "Snake" Stuart left the body behind to gather more heavy equipment, the elements, scavengers, or the damp forest floor would rapidly destroy the precious biological tissue, ruining any chance of DNA testing. Therefore, Charles "Snake" Stuart had to treat Bigfoot not as a personal hunting trophy, but as a delicate, priceless forensic crime scene. He carefully documented the immediate environment, noting the position of the body, the surrounding foliage, and the absence of any signs of violence, suggesting that the giant had simply crawled into this quiet sanctuary to die of old age. By the time Charles "Snake" Stuart finally reached his transport vehicle at the remote edge of the wilderness, his body was battered, but his resolve was ironclad. He had successfully bypassed the watchful eyes of the state, navigated some of the most rugged terrain in North America, and secured a physical body that would challenge centuries of scientific dogma. As he secured the heavy tarp in the back of his truck, Charles "Snake" Stuart looked back at the dark wall of the Adirondack pines, knowing that the physical extraction of Dack was complete. But the struggle to prove the existence of this genetic marvel to a highly skeptical world was only just beginning. The true shock, however, lay in the physical details of the body itself. Anatomy of the specimen, what the eyes see. To peer closely at the physical remains of the specimen recovered by Charles "Snake" Stuart is to step across a threshold that separates modern myth from physical forensic reality. For decades, the global conversation surrounding these elusive forest giants has been crippled by a lack of physical evidence, relying on blurry videos, disputed footprints, and highly subjective eyewitness accounts. But Charles "Snake" Stuart changed the nature of the debate by bringing a tangible, biological body out of the mountains, providing a physical blueprint that can be measured, touched, and thoroughly analyzed. In the hands of Charles "Snake" Stuart, Dack is no longer a ghost of the woods. He is a complex biological machine designed perfectly for survival in the harshest environments of North America. The anatomical details of this body offer a stunning look at how a relic hominid species adapted to the brutal winters of upstate New York. The first physical attribute that Charles "Snake" Stuart documented was the staggering scale of the muscular and skeletal system. Standing at 8 feet tall, Dack is built with a skeletal density that far surpasses that of a modern human being, mirroring the robust skeletal structures of ancient Neanderthals. Charles Snake Stuart noted that the bones are remarkably thick, with large joint surfaces designed to bear immense weight and absorb the heavy shock of running through rugged, uneven mountain terrain. The ribcage is barrel-shaped, a classic evolutionary adaptation that allows for a massive lung capacity, which Charles Snake Stuart argues is crucial for highly active, large-bodied mammals operating in cold, oxygen-depleted alpine environments. This physical design allows the creature to regulate its body temperature and maintain high-energy physical output, even when the temperature drops far below freezing. When Charles Snake Stuart examined the hands and feet of Dack, he found details that completely shatter the idea of a simple ape-like cryptid. The hands are incredibly human-like in their structure, featuring a fully opposable thumb that is robust and powerful. Charles Snake Stuart observed that the palms are covered in thick, leathery calluses, suggesting a life spent grasping rough granite, climbing steep rock faces, and manipulating heavy forest materials. Most remarkably, the fingertips of the specimen exhibit clear, distinct dermal ridges, the scientific term for fingerprints. Charles Snake Stuart points out that these ridges are highly complex, featuring unique whorl and loop patterns that are biologically characteristic of advanced primates and hominids, completely ruling out any simple synthetic fabrication. The foot structure of the specimen is equally revealing to Charles Snake Stuart's investigation. Measuring over 16 inches in length, the foot is wide, flat, and lacks the pronounced arch found in modern humans. Charles Snake Stuart analyzed the footprint mechanics, noting that the foot has a mid-tarsal break, a flexible joint in the middle of the foot that allows it to conform to uneven surfaces like rocks, fallen logs, and soft mud. This specialized joint gives Dack incredible stability, allowing a 300-pound creature to move through the thick forest with a level of silence and agility that would be impossible for a modern human. Charles Snake Stuart believes this unique foot anatomy explains how these giants can disappear so quickly into the dense brush without leaving a noisy, disruptive trail behind them. The head and face of Dack, the Bigfoot, present a striking hybrid appearance that Charles Snake Stuart describes as both hauntingly human and ancient. The skull features a heavy, prominent brow ridge that shades the deep, wide eye sockets designed to protect the eyes from glare and falling debris. Charles Snake Stuart noted that the jaw is massive and lacks a protruding chin, a classic diagnostic feature of the Neanderthal lineage. The teeth are large and exhibit heavy wear patterns, suggesting a diverse, coarse diet of tough vegetation, roots, and raw meat.
20-year-old creature that's 8 feet tall, 300 pounds. We found in its stomach a diet that's consistent of a scavenger lifestyle. So these are opportunity eaters. These migrate vast territories.
Charles Snake Stuart's close examination of the skull also revealed a slight sagittal crest, a bony ridge running along the top of the skull, which serves as an attachment point for powerful jaw muscles, giving Dack an incredibly strong bite. The skin and hair of the specimen show a level of environmental adaptation that fascinated Charles Snake Stuart. The hair is not uniform. It consists of a dual coat system similar to that of cold-weather mammals. There is a coarse, water-resistant outer guard hair that sheds rain and snow, and a dense, fine undercoat that traps body heat close to the skin. Charles Snake Stuart observed that the skin underneath this coat is heavily pigmented and remarkably thick, offering protection against thorny underbrush, biting insects, and the biting mountain wind. By analyzing these physical traits, Charles Snake Stuart has built an undeniable case that Dack is a masterpiece of natural engineering, perfectly adapted to live in the shadows of the human world. Yet, the scientific elite refuse to open the laboratory doors. The academic wall, the Cornell standoff. The moment Charles Snake Stuart stepped out of the dark, tangled canopy of the Adirondacks and attempted to present the physical evidence of Dack to the scientific establishment, he collided with an invisible, immovable barrier. For decades, independent field researchers have argued that mainstream academia suffers from a form of institutional blindness, actively refusing to look at physical evidence that does not fit neatly into predetermined evolutionary models. But Charles "Snake" Stuart was determined to force their hand. He knew that to breach this academic wall, he could not just tell colorful stories around campfires or show off impressive plaster footprint casts. He needed the cold, hard, undisputed validation of a world-renowned scientific laboratory. This absolute necessity is what drove Charles "Snake" Stuart to approach the prestigious veterinary DNA laboratory at Cornell University. Armed with biological tissue samples taken directly from the preserved frozen remains of Dack, Charles "Snake" Stuart sought to bypass the traditional academic gatekeepers and let the raw genetic sequencing speak for itself. The conflict that followed is a classic study in institutional tension, representing a deep philosophical divide between elite scientists and rugged field trackers. According to Charles "Snake" Stuart, he secured the genetic testing through proper, standard laboratory channels, submitting biological samples under strict chain-of-custody protocols to ensure they were never contaminated by human contact or external environmental factors. When Charles "Snake" Stuart publicly announced that the official DNA results showed a mind-boggling 58.5% Neanderthal and 41.5% modern human split, he expected the scientific community to erupt in excitement, recognizing that the evolutionary tree had just been rewritten.
When we submitted our DNA evidence to the Cornell Veterinary and BioDNA Lab, the results came back at 58.5% Neanderthal.
Instead, Charles "Snake" Stuart was met with a wall of absolute icy silence, followed by immediate, highly aggressive pushback from academic spokespersons. Cornell University officials, when pressed by national media outlets, flatly refused to validate the explosive claims made by Charles "Snake" Stuart. Spokespersons for the university declined to comment or confirm that any such official genetic testing on an unknown hominid had ever occurred within their facilities, leaving Charles "Snake" Stuart standing completely alone in the public arena to defend his findings. This intense standoff reveals a profound divergence in how evidence is processed and accepted by independent trackers versus academic institutions. For Charles "Snake" Stuart, the reluctance of Cornell to openly champion the DNA results is proof of a deeply ingrained institutional fear, a reluctance to publish findings that would throw a century of established anthropological teaching into utter chaos. To acknowledge the specimen secured by Charles "Snake" Stuart as a biological reality would mean admitting that a massive, highly intelligent cousin of humanity has been living right alongside us in the Empire State, completely undetected by modern science. Charles "Snake" Stuart argues that the academic elite would rather protect their tenure, their published textbooks, and their government research grants than risk their professional reputations on a discovery that challenges the status quo. In his view, the university's refusal to engage with the data is a defensive mechanism designed to keep the keys of human history in the hands of a select few. On the other side of this academic wall, established researchers argue that the extraordinary nature of Charles "Snake" Stuart's claims requires an equally extraordinary level of scientific rigor. Geneticists point out that mapping the genome of a completely new hominid is not a simple overnight task that can be accomplished with a single sample submission. It requires extensive peer-reviewed studies, double-blind testing at multiple independent laboratories worldwide, and the publication of raw sequencing data for the global scientific community to dissect. From the institutional perspective, Charles "Snake" Stuart's public media campaigns, television appearances, and bold announcements bypassed the essential, methodical steps of the scientific method, making it impossible for serious academics to officially align themselves with his findings. Some prominent figures in the field of wildlife research went so far as to publicly question the authenticity of the samples Charles "Snake" Stuart claimed to have submitted, suggesting that the results could be the product of sample contamination or a massive misunderstanding of the laboratory's raw data reports. But Charles "Snake" Stuart remains entirely undeterred by the academic freeze. He points out that history is filled with instances where mainstream science ridiculed monumental discoveries before eventually being forced to accept them as truth. For Charles "Snake" Stuart, the DNA results are not a matter of debate. They are a personal certainty, and the institutional silence only serves to highlight the growing disconnect between tenured academics sitting in comfortable university offices and the boots-on-the-ground trackers who actually explore the deepest, darkest corners of the natural world. Charles Snake Stuart believes that the physical reality of Dack is too massive a truth to be kept hidden behind university walls for long. He has expressed deep frustration that the very institutions built to explore the unknown are the ones most afraid of what lies beyond the tree line. Since the academic gatekeepers refused to open the laboratory doors to validate his work, Charles Snake Stuart decided he would take a different route. He would bypass the institutions entirely and take his incredible evidence directly to the ultimate court of opinion, the public. So, if the laboratory would not show the world, the road would. The traveling spectacle, face-to-face with the public. When the cold, prestigious doors of academic institutions slam shut in the face of a revolutionary discovery, the open road becomes the only viable laboratory left. For veteran tracker Charles Snake Stuart, the decision to bypass the mainstream scientific establishment was not merely a matter of personal frustration. It was a highly calculated tactical pivot. Charles Snake Stuart realized that if tenured university scientists and laboratory directors refused to analyze, publish, or even formally acknowledge the physical remains of Dack, then the heavy burden of proof would have to fall squarely upon the shoulders of the public. Charles Snake Stuart understood that humanity possesses an innate, deep-seated curiosity about the unexplained mysteries of the natural world. By bringing a 300-pound, 8-foot-tall biological specimen directly into the light of local communities, Charles Snake Stuart transformed what could have been a forgotten file in a dusty cabinet into a living, breathing cultural phenomenon that could not be easily ignored. The absolute epicenter of this public awakening became the sprawling, bustling grounds of the Great New York State Fair in Syracuse, New York. Here, amid the bright neon lights of the Midway, the delicious scent of fried food, and the low, constant hum of thousands of daily visitors, Charles Snake Stuart set up a heavily secured, specialized exhibition tent. Inside, resting on a custom-built, refrigerated display bed to prevent any further decay of the fragile organic tissue, lay the physical form of Dack. For a small admission fee, everyday citizens, excited families, outdoor enthusiasts, and hardened skeptics alike were invited to walk up to the reinforced glass and stare directly into the face of a creature they had been told was an absolute impossibility. Charles Snake Stuart watched closely as visitors reacted, noting how the initial smiles and light-hearted laughter of the crowd almost instantly evaporated the moment they stepped into the dim light of the enclosure and came face-to-face with the immense scale and intricate physical details of the specimen. The deep psychological impact of this face-to-face encounter is something Charles Snake Stuart has documented extensively. Seeing a flat photograph in a newspaper or watching a shaky, heavily edited video on a computer screen is an experience easily dismissed by the modern mind. But standing merely inches away from a massive, calloused, five-fingered hand with human-like fingernails and looking closely at a heavy, prominent brow ridge covered in coarse, weathered hair, triggers a visceral, evolutionary response in the human brain. Charles Snake Stuart observed that people did not look at the exhibit and see a simple animal. They recognized a biological cousin. The traveling display bridged the massive gap between folklore and concrete physical biology, forcing observers to confront the eerie reality that a parallel human species has been navigating the same dense mountain forests where they hike, camp, and fish every weekend. This traveling exhibit also tapped into a rich historical tradition of public biology and roadside spectacles. For over a century, traveling shows have claimed to exhibit wonders of the natural world, though many of those historical displays were eventually exposed as clever fabrications made of plaster, papier-mâché, and taxidermy animal fur. But Charles Snake Stuart maintains that Dack stands entirely apart from those historical hoaxes. Alongside the preserved remains, Charles Snake Stuart prominently displayed the documentation of his alleged DNA findings, presenting a highly detailed narrative that challenged every single visitor to weigh the physical evidence of their own eyes against the official silence of the academic institutions. It became a highly polarizing, interactive experience where the public was forced to act as the ultimate jury, deciding for themselves if Charles "Snake" Stuart had truly solved one of the greatest mysteries on Earth. As the exhibit toured throughout the region, it became clear that Charles "Snake" Stuart had successfully bypassed the academic blockouts. The news of Dack spread rapidly through local news segments and viral social media posts, creating a grassroots momentum that no university panel could easily suppress. People began looking at the vast, dark horizons of the forest with a renewed sense of wonder and caution. Charles "Snake" Stuart's public crusade proved that you do not need the validation of a scientific elite to ignite a massive cultural shift. By taking his discovery straight to the streets, Charles "Snake" Stuart ensured that the story of Dack would not be swept under the rug of institutional denial, leaving a lasting mark on the public imagination. We are no longer alone in the dark, with the academic elite locked in their silent towers and the public gazing in awe through the glass. The story of Dack, the Bigfoot, has forever changed the way we look at the vast, whispering wilderness. Charles "Snake" Stuart didn't just find a body. He dragged our evolutionary cousin into the light of the 21st century, forcing us to redefine what it means to be human. Whether science ultimately embraces the beast or continues to turn a blind eye, the trees will never look the same. To keep tracking mysteries like this, hit that subscribe button right now.